Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman. Since the election, we've struggled to cabin our disappointment, but we have tried to remain both clear-eyed about the serious threats that Trump's upcoming tenure presents, threats that the past few weeks since the election have done nothing to diminish, and yet constructive in a path ahead through and around daunting obstacles. I think of my guest today as much as anyone in American academic and public intellectual life as someone who combines the conceptualization of broad ideas in political science, ideas like tyranny, freedom, nationalism, with to-the-minute trenchant analysis of what is to be done now and throughout the seemingly endless 215 weeks until the end of Trump's second term. Tim Snyder is the Levin Professor of History at Yale University, the author of many books of history and political science, including Our Malady, On Tyranny, The Road to Unfreedom, Bloodlands, and his latest, On Freedom. His work has received multiple awards, including the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He also is the author of a hugely popular Substack, which I reviewed the last few months of and can't recommend highly enough, called Thinking About. Thanks very much for being with us, Professor Snyder, or may I call you Tim?
Please, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I propose we move from the sublime to the ridiculous. I'd like to first delve into some of the broader foundational ideas in your work and then bring home, as you do in your Substack, among other places, to the pretty past that we find ourselves in. So let's start with freedom and your book On Freedom. We often think of it here as a concept of personal liberty and a right as against the state, not to be constrained. You take up a definition that I think it's fair to say it puts it in a broader social context, maybe a context of collective responsibility. How does the notion of freedom, as you perceive it, Tim, differ from traditional American understandings of freedom, would you say?
I'll answer that way, but I wanna start by saying that I wrote this book because I was trying to get freedom right.
Yeah.
So like I disagree with a lot of things and people and traditions along the way. But honestly, what was attractive about this book and why I stayed with it for so long was this challenge of actually trying to get it right. And I think the right answer, so I was going to start with the right answer before I hit the wrong answer. I think the right answer has to be that freedom is about human beings and all the things that we can become. And that what's special about us is that we can value good things. We can be unpredictable because we can live in a world which is not only physical, but moral. And then politically, where that leads you is that if freedom is positive philosophically, if it's about the good things, the condition in which we can understand and realize good things, then you want to try to create a world in which we can become that kind of person, a free person. And that world, like that work, has to be collective. So it's not that ironically where you end up is that if you care about creating free individuals, if you want to step out into that broader world of making things better, you then have to think about how we can work together. It's absolutely inextricable. So what's wrong is negative freedom, where you're thinking freedom just as being freedom from. And of course, like there is such a thing as repression in the world. I'm very well aware of this. And it's a good thing to get rid of the oppression, but it's not enough. You can knock down all the walls, but you're still left with the people. And the people have to be able to ask, who am I? What do I want to be? What does freedom mean for me? What do I care about? And the people have to have the conditions which allow them to ask and answer those questions. And just knocking down the wall isn't going to get you there. Right. And where this leads us in America is that since we think freedom is just being against stuff, we luxuriate in the easy platitude that freedom is about making the government smaller, which is a completely irrelevant thing. It doesn't matter if it's big or small. What matters is whether it creates the conditions for freedom. That's the only thing that matters. And then we luxuriate in the idea that if we rebel against the government, that somehow means that we're free, which is just silly. And we shift, and this is what I think we've done recently, we shift if we think freedom is just being against the government. It's very easy to shift from there to thinking like, well, I'm against the government, I'm against the system. I'm against my neighbor. And then freedom becomes just a matter of like an endless us and them, which doesn't take us anywhere.
Actually, it brings to mind a couple, what I think of as intellectual traditions. I'm out of my depth, but let me serve these up to you. So first, there's the, idea of negative versus positive freedom in Isaiah Berlin, two concepts of liberty, or maybe even, I think that's fair, Marx on the Jewish question. So that's one thing to ask you about how yours may be different or influenced by it. And then second, it sounds as if the freedom you posit requires, as you put it, a kind of collective responsibility. So in particular, I'm thinking that you reject the ideas of transcendentalists or people who think the way to find freedom is to go away from society and commune separately from it in order to be unfettered. That's a whole semester, I know.
So with you have to be able to do a semester in 5 minutes, and I can do it in less than five.
Okay, you can do the nickel tour or the $5 tour of Rome, as it were, but nothing in
That's
between,
right.
right?
Here comes the nickel tour, and then you can put in
Okay.
495 afterwards. On positive and negative freedom, Isaiah Berlin was one of my teachers, and this is the most
Oh,
remembered of his.
really? You
Yeah,
were, wow, I hadn't known that. Okay, go ahead.
yeah, and the way he does intellectual history has been immensely influential upon me, and I continue to admire him enormously. But I think that essay is essentially wrong. I don't think that you can say that there's a tradition of talking about freedom in these two ways, but one of them is wrong. And like so negative freedom, and I'm not the first person to say this. Charles Taylor, I think, wrote the most devastating essay about this in the 1970s. Negative freedom just can't be coherent because the reason why you care about negative freedom is positive freedom. So the reason why you care about the government being oppressive is because of the person. And so you can end government oppression, but you're still left with the question of what you're going to do with the person, which brings me to the transcendentalists. I think it's wonderful, and I'll follow Hannah Arendt here in making a distinction between loneliness and solitude. So, like, what does it take to become the kind of person who can be solitary, right? To be a solitary person, and this is true of all the transcendentalists, there's a whole lot of human education and contact which gets built up into you before you become Henry David Thoreau, right? So before I go off on Walden, a huge amount of education and love was poured into me. And that's the important part. Like, I want people to be able to go off and be on their own and do their own weird thing, whether that's, hanging out by a pond and writing a book or whatever it might be. But in order to get to that position of being an individual, there has to be a lot of collective work, whether it's moms and dads or friends or caretakers or teachers. And you can't get out of that paradox. You can't say, oh no, a perfectly free person is someone who's left on their own. Can't happen. Have a child, leave the child by a mountainside, see what happens. That's not going to be free. And once you like, and this is the next thing I wanted to say, that it's the extreme examples that kind of bring us out of our illusion that you can be free on your own. You just can't be. It's not possible. The extreme examples are things like a baby, right? Like if you've ever watched a childbirth, you can't think like, okay, now all that child needs is for the government to leave it alone,
Right,
right?
right.
It's just, it's just incredibly stupid. And then as a historian, the example or an extreme example is concentration camps, where you want to think that you've liberated the concentration camp. But then, and now I'm speaking from evidence, the doctors and the nurses and people come and they say, well, it's not a liberation. These people aren't free yet. Like, they're traumatized. They need health care. They're going to need psychological, psychiatric care. They're going to need all kinds of care for years or decades. You can't just, no matter how deep the evil is, you can't just lift it and make people free. And then the extreme example, which I've kind of lived through or touched on recently, is occupation in Ukraine, where there's a town called Yedvabne, which I mentioned in the book, where Russians put every single member of the village, every single inhabitant in the basement of the school, and they kept them there for the entire time they were occupying. And then and then the Russians are driven out, and so the occupation's over. But are those people free? No, some of them are dead, and many of them are traumatized, and they can't use the school again. And it's not just a matter of getting the Russians out; it's also a matter of where are the kids going to play now? Like, how are people going to move forward? All of that is freedom.
No man is an island. I think that point from Auschwitz, by the way, it was an actual quote, right? People came in. This wasn't a highfalutin theory. This was people seeing on the the survivors on the ground and knowing, well, they're not free. Again, this would be a semester or a whole dissertation with you as advisor, but I want to touch on one point, because you conceptualize freedom as having taking 5 forms of that connect philosophy to politics, and the fourth one in particular interests me for, I think, obvious reasons as we start to think about our current situation. And that is, as you've defined it, the grip on the world that allows us to change it. And you talk a lot about the role of disinformation in an authoritarian society. So it feels to me as if you're saying a concomitant of freedom is, truth, actual facts, things on the ground that you can agree and disagree about. And that's been so terribly devalued in the last 10 years. I just wonder if you could plug into your cluster of connecting philosophies the value of facts in the world.
Yeah, thank you. So the way the book's set up, as you just suggested, is that in the beginning there's a discussion of what freedom is, and then in the end we get to government policy. But along the way there are the forms of freedom, which are I think the concepts that we need and the ways that we should interact with each other if we want to have a land of the free. And as you say, number 4 is factuality. So let me start with a diagnosis and then kind of get to what I think health would be like. It's not actually liberating, as it turns out, to tell people that there is no truth. That's a mistake. It's not liberating to tell people that the only truth is how they feel. That turns out to be a mistake, chiefly a mistake on the left.
As well as an empirical mistake, don't you
Right.
think?
I agree. It's a mistake at every level. Because what that does is that it says that whoever then has the best story is in effect the master. Like they then control everything. Because if we don't have the facts as a structure, it's like we're being buffeted by winds of untruth or disinformation. And if we don't have any facts, like there's nothing to batten on. There's nothing to hold on to. We just get thrown this way and that. And even as we're thrown this way and that, we confuse that with being free, right? Like I believe this story, I believe that story, because I feel like believing these stories, they seem right to me, and that feels free. But in fact, we're just like to mix my metaphors, now we're pawns on a chessboard and we don't even know it's a game. We become objects. That's something Bakhtin said. Like if you're part of somebody else's story, if you're living somebody else's lie, then you're not free, right? Then you're just a plaything. And this is like that view has been weaponized, operationalized by the machine. And by the machine, I mean the concatenation of social media, before which we now spend whatever it is, 5, 6, 7 hours a day on average as Americans. Those algorithms drive us towards the notion that whatever I feel is true. And of course, they are an example of the theory that I was just trying to suggest, that the people behind the algorithms are telling certain kinds of stories, and then we live inside those stories. And those tend to be stories about how it's us against them, and which are very theoretical and denudative evidence, but are comfortable. And then I feel like I'm free when I'm against something, and I'm driven back to negative freedom. And then, like you've already suggested, the positive answer, which is that in order to be able to stand up against the forces of wealth and power of the day, whether it's now or whether it's ancient Greece, when Euripides originally had this idea, in order to be able to stand up against that, you have to have the facts to give you traction. You have to have the facts to literally to be able to stand your ground. Because if other people are more wealthy and powerful than you, as they always will be, the truth is the only thing that you can hold up against them. It's the only sword that you can hold in your hand. It's literally the only thing. And then in terms of collective action, you can't make policy. Like you and I can have different values, and we should, but if we can't agree as to whether the water is polluted, then nothing's ever going to happen about water pollution. And if we can't agree that there's such a thing as water pollution, then really nothing's ever going to happen, and we're both going to die next week probably. And so you need the facts to have collective action. You also need the facts to have other things that are like trials. You can't, without facts, you can't have the basic institutions that you need. So it's not just me having traction, it's also institutions having traction. If you take factuality away, then the institutions also disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's an apt description of one of the things that most ail us in our political discourse. I don't remember a time where parties are not only so opposed to each other, but literally they live in world A and world B, and there's no way of even beginning with some kind of factual consensus. All right, this leads me to the one other big idea I was hoping you would talk about in a nickel way, and that's the F word, fascism, from which I really, I think, like a lot of commentators tried to steer away from because it's got such rhetorical baggage, and your every analogy you draw it in 1933, you have to defend yourself against it. Well, you're just calling Trump Hitler. But as things really evolved during the campaign, by the very end, I found myself unable to avoid that word, and you use it a fair bit, just in an objective political historian kind of way. And I think in particular, so I wanted to ask you about analysis of the current situation in terms of fascist ideas, fascist historical precedents, but in particular, this notion that I think you characteristically identify with fascists of removal of meaning, of essentially turning the word fascist itself into a meaningless insult, but just generally draining discourse of an agreed on glossary, whatever, more like it, it means whatever I say it means, or you can bandy about different ideas without having to actually own up to a shared meaning. Does that make sense based on your ideas?
Yeah, no, that's very good. I mean, I want to start. I don't know what your own trajectory on this was besides what you just told me, but I want to start with the taboo because I think the taboo is pretty important. It worried me a lot that we had this taboo because it seemed like a lot of it came out of American exceptionalism, and where folks wanted to say, well, you're talking about Italy or Romania or Germany, and therefore you're not talking about the US. Whereas I was thinking, well, I'm talking about humans and the things they're capable of. And Italy and Romania and Germany weren't exactly like one another either, but there's still a zone, there's a zone of fascist practice and fascist convictions, and people can get pulled into that zone. And we need the history to give some flesh to how that what might look like. The other thing, besides the American exceptionalism, which bothered me about it, is that when we put, like, I worry that when we put these taboos on history, that we're kind of just like making it impossible to learn from history in general. Because if I'm not like, okay, I'm a historian of Hitler, so I feel like I have a, I'm allowed to talk about Hitler. But if we say, like, if our first reaction is let's not talk about Hitler, how are we then supposed to do the never again part? Like, if your first reaction is it ain't happening here, then like that's not the same as never again, right? Like never again has to acknowledge that there is a thing that could happen again in some version. So like for the last 10 years or so, I've been pretty frustrated by this because yeah, of course, it's not exactly like Hitler and the Germans, but we're also, I mean, starting from the other end, we're not better than they are, so why not let that in? And it seems to be like part of a general, like in the last 25 years, a kind of general jettisoning of the past. And like it's a little bit too convenient when folks say, let's not talk about fascism, when in fact we're also not talking about the past in general. At least that's like as a professional historian, that's how I feel about it as well. But what for me, like it's important to see fascism as a presence. Like I wrote this New York, I finally got this idea straight, I think, in an article I wrote for the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, where the critique of Trump is like, he's not this, he's not that, he's not the other thing. Oh, look, he's not following the rule of law, he's not following rules of decorum. But it's not what he's not, it's what he is, right? And what he is, to take your example, is someone who charismatically is able to separate, words from their meanings and attach different meanings to those words and to have people go along with him, which is a fascist performance. That's exactly what it is. And we need that term to describe that thing and to see it as a presence so we can then come to grips with it. And by the way, this hooks up to your previous question, because I think when we convince ourselves that there is no factuality, like we're making a step towards, we've already taken a step ourselves in the direction of fascism. That's why on tyranny I wrote post-truth is pre-fascism. I think that's correct. And and we let ourselves live with the machines, I think the machines also prepare us. They gin us up for fascism because they get us used to this notion of impulse, emotion, us versus them, which we then take out into the real world, and we encounter a figure like Trump who is consistent with that experience and who helps kind of cross the boundary from social media into the real world. So it's not exactly like it was 100 years ago, but I think the concept of fascism casts more light than shadow. Like I agree with critics that it casts a lot of shadows, but I think at this point it casts more light than shadow.
And look, once you're just talking about it rationally in terms of aspects, I think it's you who pointed out. I'm not sure in the New York article, but I mean, one really important parallel with Hitler is the coming to power through democratic means. We're not talking about, boots on the ground or whatever, but a kind of seizure of the levers of democracy. And of course, Germany, 19th century Germany, it's not America, but it's the grandness of it. All right, speaks for itself. Okay, so I wanted now to zoom forward to the current day, and I thought we'd start with your posting of an hour ago with the idea that, as you put it, that Americans may be drawn to strongman rule, but you, I think, very effectively puncture the idea and provide three ways in which it's a fantasy and just deeply mistaken. Here, I just summarized them so you don't have to, but I wanted you to sort of elaborate. But the strong man is for you a total theme of the campaign. I'm almost messianic terms. I'm here as your retribution. The strong man will unite. Haha. The strong man will get things done. It really seems to fit like a T with T for Trump. I wonder if you'd, just elaborate that in terms of people's apparent, nearly 50% of the country's embrace of Trump, which might have seemed preposterous 4 years ago.
I'm going to cheat here a little bit and give a little footnote to the last question because they're kind of connected. I forgot to say on the Hitler comparison, we were all supposed to be deterred from doing that for whatever reason. And then it turns out that J.D. Vance says that Trump is Hitler. And then Trump says Hitler is Hitler. Like when Trump says he wants Hitler's generals, he's putting himself in the position of Hitler in a positive sense, right? And I want to give Trump, so to speak, credit for this because I think Trump actually has in his own way a quite sophisticated understanding of how politics work and how human emotions work. And precisely because it is a mostly fascist way, many of us can not understand it or pretend not to understand it or not want to understand it. But when he talks about Hitler's generals, here's what he means. The soldiers of the United States Armed Forces swear an oath to the Constitution. And in that oath to the Constitution, and so within the Constitution, there are certain things that they ought not to do. The soldiers of Weimar Germany, of interwar Germany, swore a similar oath to the Constitution. That changed in August of 1934 because Hitler understood that he needed the armed forces to have, as Trump would say, loyalty, personal loyalty to him. And that jump, which may seem like some obscure institutional thing, is hugely important in every way because now the soldiers are no longer soldiers of a German constitution. They're no longer servants of a German rule of law. They are the personal followers of a personal leader. And not incidentally, it's exactly that moment, August 1934, that Hitler becomes der Führer. It's that moment that he becomes the leader. That's when they start using that term. It's at that moment that he himself is above the law, just like the soldiers are following him beyond the law. And that moment is also critical for what those soldiers then do later on. So from like an American, Nuremberg point of view, we always say they say they were just following orders and we don't understand that. But it's from 1934, all there was the orders. They were no longer sworn to the Constitution. And this is directly relevant to Trump because this is where Trump is going. I would be very surprised if Trump doesn't try to do exactly that thing and superimpose some kind of additional oath or some kind of way around the oath of American officers and soldiers to the Constitution.
And sorry to interrupt, but we already know he's looking to concretely have power to remove disloyal general with this sort of extra army consortium that can fire people, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, no, you're not interrupting me. It's all about, it's the same, it's all, you're right. It's all about making the army into a tool of a person, right? As opposed to being an institution which is inside some kind of constitutional structure, right? And then hooking into your bigger question, this is an example of how things will not get done. Because, what is the army supposed to do? The United States Army or the armed forces are supposed to protect us from external threats. It's supposed to be Department of Defense. What will happen instead if Trump gets his way is that this will be a force which will go after Americans, or go after people who are settled in the United States. And the attempt to do those things will not turn out the way that people expect. It's not going to be like, even if you are, this is where the strongman fantasy comes in. Even if you are like somebody who likes dictatorship, when Trump comes after your neighbors or, eventually you, using members of the American Armed Forces or other parts of the executive branch, it's not going to feel the way that you want to feel. It's going to be messy. It's going to be unpredictable. It's going to be traumatizing. You're not going to have a good, clean feeling that something has happened, right? And adapting to that, you're going to end up changing yourself. Or deportation. If they try to use the armed forces for deportation, yes, maybe you can at huge financial, I mean, it's going to cost about, at least I added up $200 billion, but huge financial and moral costs. You could perhaps order American soldiers to do this. But I mean, you'll be traumatizing them. You'll be changing their sense of what their job is. You'll be putting violence in the faces of American children all over the country. And at best, you're going to, and at best is the wrong way to say it, but you're going to end up with lots of people in what are in effect concentration camps, because you're not going to be able easily to push them across the border. That's not how borders work. And so you're going to end up with people in detention camps in Texas, as a spectacle and as a preparation for things going wrong. And so that's a predictable example of how the strongman fantasy goes wrong. Because with deportation, people imagine, oh, we just snap our fingers and these people we don't like, these illegals, are going to just disappear. And that's not how a deportation action looks. It's corrupting and bending and terrible every step along the way.
I really agree. I don't know if you know the work of Andrea Pitzer, but on concentration camps, but she's made this point, but I just think it's so deeply morally wrong. It's a whole different model, military, to protect us against external threats, and we don't care if they've committed crimes, they're the outsider, versus holding, these are essentially part of our society to account. It's going to be a total bloodbath, I think, sort of morally, socially, visually. Well, let me let's keep going, though. I mean, you think of analogs to different authoritarian governments, but man, I don't know of a historical analog to what happened here, where he was so clearly was Trump, showed his colors in front of the whole country, and the American people. So I'm following up on the strongman rule. I mean, we saw the fantasy of it. We saw, the ineffectiveness of it, COVID, bleach. I could go on and on. But what the hell happened? Do you think the American people succumbed a second time to the same series of misconceptions about a strong man? Or did they ignore them because of the cost of milk in the supermarket? It's historians are going to, I think, be trying to make sense of this for a long time, but it's as if Hitler leaves in 38 and they bring him back in 42 or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, one doesn't want to push this point too hard, but Hitler did have a failed coup, which was kind of embarrassing.
Yeah, okay.
Going to prison and writing a rambling memoir, known as Mein Kampf.
Well, that was before. Oh, I see. Yeah, you mean we were talking World War I time?
Yeah, I mean, he did have a first public, failure, and then which was kind of outrageous and led to people dying, and then he ended up being elected. And I think a lot of people who are smarter than me and better at this sort of thing will have answers, but I would want to suggest that first, this has a lot to do with the disinformation part that we were talking about earlier and what you referred to as like country A and country B, where it's not just a matter of having different information, it's also a matter of having like differently programmed enemy complexes, where a lot of folks are getting a lot of satisfaction out of the idea that other people aren't going to get things, right? Which is what I call in the book pseudo-populism. Like the government isn't there to give you stuff. The government is there to make sure that other people suffer more than you do, and then you take some satisfaction out of that, which in MAGA jargon is known as owning the libs. Like we're happy
Right.
because you're not going to be able to build those roads, which would have been good for all of us, but we're happy because we've denied you the possibility of building those roads. We're happy because we think that those Mexicans and those blacks are not going to get that health insurance. But in fact, like nobody's going to get the health insurance. Everybody's going to suffer more. It's going to be bad for everybody. That's part of it. And I think part of it is also that Trump had this advantage of being both the incumbent and the challenger at the same time. I think he had the advantages of both because, you're talking about the bleach, but most people don't remember that honestly, or they don't remember that that was Trump rather than Biden. I mean, an astonishing amount of Americans think that things that happened under Trump happened under Biden. And I think that Trump got like because Americans' memory is, very, very short. We're specialists in this. We wake up every morning and it's a new day. I think because of that, Trump like got a lot of warm nostalgia out of his first term, and he got to be the challenger against an incumbent. And it's almost like the fact that Trump did such a horrible job with COVID ended up helping him. He killed 1 million people who didn't have to die with his COVID policies. But the result was that the economic consequences took 7 years to clean up, and therefore he could turn up at the end of it and say, "Oh, look, I'm an answer to this, this inflation, which is like the last sputtering result of the COVID crisis," right? So he got to be the challenger to his own incumbency almost. And it put Harris in this very weird position because then she had to be simultaneously like defending Biden and trying to present something new. She had to be both the challenger and the incumbent in a much more challenging way. And so that's my kind of banal, explanation of what was on there.
I have a feeling we're going to see a lot more of that, taking credit for things that he doesn't deserve and
Oh, yeah.
pushing other things off on Biden. Tim, I wish we could go a whole semester. I don't want to take too much advantage of your time. So just to flash forward, you've been cited a fair bit, or people think of you as someone with, not simply, I feel my own role these days is mainly to be a, soothsayer of doom. But you've been thought of as being somewhat constructive here. I want to end with an article something you said in the New York Times and ask you to comment on it now because that was in September. But you said if we draw the right lessons from extreme situations, we can connect freedom to government. Then that better future awaits us. A beautiful range of possibilities for unpredictable, unruly people, though that unruly really caught my eye. So what element of optimism do you have in your current look at the landscape? Do you see the whole American experiment as genuinely tenuous? What's your you needn't have, I feel I'm asked for this and I don't have necessarily in my little legal world a hopeful message, but what's your constructive thinking looking ahead, if any?
It's funny, like I wrote on tyranny and on freedom, and like the wrong book is selling more copies at the moment, right? Like on freedom is a philosophical, but it's about a political opening up, right? It's about how, and this is part of the optimism behind it. It's about how our problems are conceptual, and since they're conceptual, you can make an argument when this is very old-fashioned me, I know, but like you can make an argument, you can win an argument, you can get freedom right, and when you do that, then you see all these political possibilities which you didn't see before, and then you get into positive reinforcing cycles where because you got the idea right, you got the policy right, and then the policy reinforces the idea, and then you go forward. And I still believe in that, and I still also believe that the U.S. has an incredible accumulation still, although we're on the decline, unfortunately, in some of these things. But we have an incredible accumulation of expertise. It's a word people don't like, but we still have extraordinary elite knowledge across a huge number of fields. We have we have more wealth than any other country has ever had in the world, although it's very poorly distributed at the moment. And we have lots of small, medium-sized companies doing really cool things with technology, by which I don't mean the big social media companies who do not do technology. They essentially do mid-20th century behavioralism at light speed, but that's not really technology, or it's low technology at best. But we do have a lot of that stuff going on. We have a lot of these assets. So one can still imagine that, if we get lucky in a lot of ways for the next 4 years, that some of these good things have come together, the ideas and the assets. But for the next 4 years, like my main concern where we're standing right now, which is late November 2024, my main concern is that the Republic isn't going to hold together. The narrative that I'm worried about is less the one where Trump marches through the door and America becomes a dictatorship, from San Francisco to Portland, Maine immediately. I'm more worried about what happens, going back to the strongman fantasy essay, like what happens when he tries to do stuff. And then those attempts will lead to bad things, but they'll also lead to reverberations and shudderings, right? So if Trump tries to use the military to deport people, to what extent does the military go along? And what does it mean for the military not to go along with the commander in chief? What does it mean if the military decides it's going to follow the Constitution rather than what are clearly illegal orders? What does that mean? What does it mean if some parts of the federal government that are armed are not in agreement with other parts of the federal government that are armed? What does it mean if Trump tries to purge the civil service of everybody who's qualified, right? Which is their announced aim, to replace everybody who knows what they're doing with incompetent loyalists. Whole efforts of the federal government that we take for granted then stop working, right? What does that then mean? And what does it mean when he goes after individuals, if he does, right? Who rallies around those individuals? And what does it mean when if states try to resist some of this? And so what I worry about the most are like lines of fracture within the republic at the level of the federal government and between the federal government and the states, and that the attempt to carry out what I would label as a regime change will break the thing apart before it actually, fails or succeeds. That's the thing personally that I'm trying to, I'm stupid to say this, but like that's what I would like to be working towards holding on, right? Like that's the danger, like, because if there's no US, there's no US Senate. If there's no US, there's no US Supreme Court. Right? Like all kinds of people who have been looking, I mean, Supreme Court may be Exhibit A, but like all the kinds of people who've been looking, as it were, like from on high on this and pretending that it's just like the correct ideological development of the US and not recognizing that just in institutional or simple human psychological terms, you can push things to a point where they start to break. And not recognizing, that states don't last forever, republics don't last forever, no republic will ever last forever, and that you can push things too far. Like that's the realization that I guess I wish folks who are on the more conservative side would have. I mean, there are people who just want to burn it down, right? And I'm not talking to them, but there are people who actually believe in the American Republic and think that Trump is somehow consistent with that. And I think his announced ideas and his announced cabinet appointments are inconsistent with the survival of the American Republic, and that one has to start thinking in terms of the Republic and being a friend of the Republic, if we're going to hold all that off.
And there's an end, I guess, for now. And it's that point that you culminated with that people I don't think fully appreciate, and I've tried my best to understand, which is if it's not exactly a one-way ratchet, the examples of history is, when things break apart that way, like a political law of entropy or whatever, you can't just reassemble. Tim, it's been such a pleasure and exciting 45 minutes. Thanks so much for spending it with us, and I hope maybe you'll come back.
Okay. Thanks, Harry. Really glad we got a chance to talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, Associate Producer Gabriella Glick, Sound Engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.